Number 1.
Lee was last seen by her aunt and uncle at around 7:30 p.m. on January 4, 2013. She'd initially had plans to go skating with friends at the local arena, as it was her last weekend at home before she was to head back to school at Frontier Collegiate Institute in Cranberry Portage, Manitoba. Her friends eventually cancelled the outing, but Lee decided to head out anyway, this according to a text she sent to another friend. Before leaving the house, her uncle reminded her that she needed to return home before curfew. Not long after Lee left, one of her friends came by the house. However, the two did not cross paths while on the way to their respective destinations. That night, Lee didn't return home. At first, her aunt and uncle weren't too worried, as they assumed she'd decided to spend the night at a friend's house. However, she didn't arrive home the next day, nor called to inform them of her whereabouts, which led them to suspect something was wrong. It was then that the community as a whole banded together to search for the now missing teenager. On January 6, 2013, her family heard a radio report about a body being found near a snowmobile trail on the reserve. It was later confirmed to be Lee's after police conducted a community headcount and found her to be the only one missing. She still had her skates with her, and her sister was able to identify them and the bag she'd been carrying with her the night she disappeared. According to reports, she was located along the trail around 10 a.m. that morning. Her body was so badly disfigured that, initially, it was believed she'd fell victim to wolves or wild dogs. However, upon further examination, it was found she'd actually been beaten, meaning she was the victim of a homicide. There were defensive wounds on the body, meaning Lee had fought against her killer, and some animal activity was observed. It's believed she died before 10 p.m. on the night of January 4, with her killer dumping her body along the trail. On the weekend Lee was murdered, the ice road that leads to God's Lake Narrows was closed, which indicated to investigators with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that her killer was likely someone within the community. At the time, there were only 285 homes on the reserve, which suggested to most that this would be an open and shut investigation. However, that wouldn't be the case. After a few days, investigators left, returning sporadically over the years. Lee's family believes whoever murdered her could have come from outside the reserve, given where her body was found. It's common for people to smuggle alcohol into the legally dry community via snowmobile, meaning her killer could have been someone with access to a snow machine. This is a detail they believe could have helped the RCMP narrow their search for suspects. Her family worries that much of the evidence surrounding the murder may have been missed or covered up, as the area had experienced heavy snow on the day her body was found. Lee's blood and toxicology were sent away for analysis and showed she had no alcohol or illicit drugs in her system at the time of her death. A rumor began to spread around the community, saying Lee had attended a house party on the night she disappeared, hosted by a local girl named Josephine B. The rumor also noted that Lee's boyfriend, Max Chubb, had gone looking for her at the home but hadn't been allowed to enter, as it was a girls-only party. Josephine denies Lee was in attendance. Another rumor involves Max's cousin and Josephine's brother, Stephen Chubb. In a story that has been confirmed by Lee's cousin, Destiny Anderson, Stephen admitted to an unidentified woman that he'd killed someone but refused to name the individual. He'd also sent Lee a Facebook message the morning after she disappeared. As a result, Stephen was brought in for questioning by the RCMP twice and was administered a lie detector test, which he passed. During these interrogations, Stephen shared that he and Lee had been in a secret relationship that ended a few months prior. In April 2013, the community offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in the case. The RCMP returned to God's Lake Narrows to obtain DNA samples from community members, many of whom submitted theirs voluntarily. A sample was taken from Stephen, who hopes the results will clear him of suspicion. In 2019, it was revealed that swabs taken from Lee's clothing and body showed a male DNA profile. Investigators have also turned to social media numerous times throughout the years in order to try and stir up new leads that may help solve the case. In April 2016, Lee's family and that of another murdered woman 22-year-old Crystal Andrews, protested outside of the RCMP's headquarters in Winnipeg, Manitoba. They were upset over the slow progress in both cases and wanted justice to be served. Just under 2 years later, in March 2018, 37-year-old Michael William Akamo was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in relation to Crystal's case. An unnamed 23-year-old man was arrested in connection to Lee's case in 2017 in a move the RCMP called significant. However, he was released the next day without being charged. While the reasons for his release have never been revealed, investigators say he still remains a suspect. A list of suspects has been assembled by the RCMP and has been narrowed down with help of the God's Lake Narrows community. Several suspects came to forefront immediately but were ruled out through various investigative avenues. Police have said that Lee's killer was known to her, meaning she would have trusted and been comfortable with him. The RCMP says the investigation is ongoing but aren't able to share much with the public given its ongoing nature. However, they have said they've conducted over 270 interviews. Lee's aunt has grown frustrated with investigators, saying the only contact she has with them is when she contacts them directly. This frustration is shared by many within the family. There is currently an $11,000 reward being offered in the case. In 2015, Lee's sister, Tiffany, and another of her aunts, Josie Stevenson, organized a nearly 800 kilometers annual walk from God's Lake Narrows to Winnipeg to help raise awareness about the case. They made 4 stops along the way, in Ponton, Grand Rapids, Fairford, and Winnipeg. That same year, a group of nearly 40 individuals walked from Thompson to Winnipeg to call for a renewed inquiry into Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women. Tiffany has since given birth to a daughter, whom she named Lee. In 2020, Lee's story was the incubus for a documentary theater production called God's Lake. The piece shows the complex issues those living within remote Indigenous communities face, such as problems with policing, education, child and family services, and overall safety, along with the strength they show in the face of tragedy. The production is performed by those from her community, with 4 actors delivering monologues for 24 different characters. Those with information regarding the case are asked to contact the Winnipeg detachment of the RCMP at 204-983-5420. Those wishing to remain anonymous can do so by calling Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477.
Number 2.
On October 4, 1978, a telephone employee laying cable stumbled upon the deceased body of a female in Lyon County, Iowa, near Highway 182. The woman was referred to as Jane Doe for almost 3 decades. On January 31, 2006, she was finally identified as 23-year-old Wilma June Nissen by a lab technician when her left thumbprint matched a print card in the Los Angeles Police Department. Wilma's daughter Chrissy recently reached out to me and shared her biological mother's heartbreaking story. She was only 1 when her mother disappeared and spent years wondering what happened to her. Chrissy found out her mother had been killed when a friend sent her a newspaper article stating Wilma had been identified as Jane Doe from Lyon County. Ever since then, Chrissy has devoted her life to catching Wilma's killers and bringing them to justice. Wilma was born on October 19, 1954, in San Francisco, California, to Charles and June Nissen. She had a younger sister named Mona who was mute and deaf. June abandoned both daughters when Wilma was 8, leaving them in Charles's care. Unfortunately, Charles was an incredibly neglectful parent. He would lock Wilma and Mona in a closet while he went to work. Oftentimes, Charles would even lock Mona in the trunk of his car. Wilma and Mona never went to school, and by the age of 10, Wilma still did not know how to read, write, or even use a fork to eat. Charles ultimately lost his job, at which point he and the girls became homeless and lived in his car. Eventually, Wilma and Mona were placed in separate foster homes. Mona's timeline is unknown, but Wilma was placed into the care of Marshall and Maxine Holt in December of 1964, at age 10. Wilma lived with the Holts for roughly 2 years until Maxine had a health problem and could no longer care for her. In the year 1966, Wilma was placed in several different foster homes. In 1967, she was placed into her last foster home in the care of Vince and Alice Haas. They claimed they taught Wilma how to read and write while in their care. At the age of 20, in 1974, Wilma became involved in prostitution as a means of survival. She often wore go-go boots, her nickname was Boots, and hitchhiked everywhere she went. She worked at various parties in Sioux Falls and Lyon County as an escort. She married several times and had 2 children. 1973, Wilma marries Donald Eugene Wellington, now deceased, and the couple resides in Hollywood. 1974, Wilma and Donald's relationship dissolves, and she marries Michael Palazzo, now deceased. On May 10, 1974, Wilma gives birth to Michael Palazzo Jr. 1975, Wilma begins a relationship with Robert Irvin, now deceased. The couple marries on June 21, 1977, and resides in Bellflower, California. On August 18, 1977, Wilma gives birth to Chrissy Joy Irvin. Both Michael and Chrissy were taken away from Wilma and placed into the foster care system. Chrissy was later adopted by Vince and Alice Haas, Wilma's final foster family. February 1978, Wilma leaves Robert and moves to Atlanta, Georgia, with 54-year-old Charles Inman Belt. The couple lives in Charles's mother's home. A few days later, Wilma leaves and relocates to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This is her last confirmed location. February to August 1978, Wilma's whereabouts are unknown, but police believe she worked as an escort for private parties in Sioux Falls and Lyon County. Charles tells the police after Wilma left, he never heard from her again. Wilma's body was badly decomposed when found in October, and police believe she was killed sometime between June and August of 1978. Wilma was found face down, naked from the waist up. Green khaki pants and her underwear were wrapped around her left leg, suggesting she may have been sexually assaulted. Wilma was wearing white calf-length go-go boots, and a braided hemp rope was tied around her feet. Her arms, hands and hair were brought forward, suggesting she had been dragged by the rope, possibly from a vehicle, into the ditch. Wilma wore a ring on her left ring finger. It was silver, indented with gold. Her lower jaw was missing, and she had only 2 teeth left when found. An animal attack was ruled out. Wilma's left elbow was dislocated. She had damage to her cervical vertebra and a skull fracture, 2 above her right eye. Police believe she may have been alive when she sustained those injuries and that she fought back against her killer. Authorities say Wilma suffered an especially vicious death, and in a manner only the killer would know. For this reason, they will not release her cause of death. In 2007, authorities exhumed Wilma's body to retrieve DNA evidence, but were incredibly disheartened to find the grave was filled with water and the evidence had been worn away by the elements. In May of 2016, authorities named an escort who goes by the name Sugar as a possible suspect and published her photo to the media. They claim Sugar was an escort and dancer who had a history of robbing other escorts and even clients in Sioux Falls and Lyon County, the same areas where Wilma worked as an escort. According to authorities, Sugar fled to Canada right after Wilma's murder and only returned to the United States after she was involved in a stabbing. Authorities say they interviewed Sugar several times, but she never admitted to any involvement in Wilma's murder. Authorities believe Sugar had an accomplice by the name of Peaches, her partner in crime. They believe Peaches worked alongside Wilma. Peaches is described as a light-skinned black female from Yankton, South Dakota. She also frequented Thunder Bay, Ontario. Authorities believe Sugar and Peaches robbed Wilma during one of the parties in Sioux Falls or Lyon County and then dumped her body. Peaches has never been identified or spoken to by the authorities. Today, Sugar and Peaches would be in their 60s. Authorities say they received an anonymous letter stating Wilma was seen alive on August 26, 1978. This has not been confirmed as the writer of the letter is unknown. It has been 43 years since Wilma was killed. If you have any information, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please can contact Lyon County Sheriff's Office at 712-472-8326, 712-472-8311 or 712-472-8300. You can also call the anonymous tip hotline at 712-472-8334. There is a reward of $10,000 available for any tips that lead to the arrest and conviction of Wilma's killers. Help Chrissy get closure and bring her mother's killers to justice.
Number 3.
On February 2, 2006, Aielah, Tim and their sister, Kyla, went to the Pine Center Mall, where they planned to spend the day shopping. It was located just 4 miles from their home, so Audrey was the one to drop them off. Little did she know that the last time she would see Aielah would be in the mall's parking lot. While at the mall, Aielah and Kyla ran into some friends who had decided to spend the night drinking and asked if they wanted to come along. Tim decided not to join them and parted ways with his sisters in the parking lot. Before he left, he told them to not accept any drugs or drinks from anyone. From there, the events of the night become uncertain. At some point, Aielah and Kyla became separated. Family members claim she'd spent the night at a friend's house, with Audrey having received information she'd planned to go to a friend's house for a sleepover. However, when Kyla arrived home early the next morning, she found her sister was nowhere to be found. Audrey spent the day of February 3 waiting for Aielah to come home. Concerned, she questioned her children about her movements the previous day in order to develop a more clearer timeline. She eventually went to the local police detachment to file a missing persons report, but was told she'd have to wait 78 hours to report her daughter as missing, despite her being a minor. A missing persons report was officially filed for Aielah on February 6, 2006. While waiting the necessary 78 hours, the family had combed the city, contacted friends and family, and put up flyers all over downtown Prince George. Audrey failed to give up the search, with Tim often accompanying his mother as she ventured into the rougher areas of the city at all hours of the day, this including alleyways and residential yards. While Kyla and her friends would search areas where she was known to hang out, Aielah's older sister, Sarah, stayed by the phone in case she called. Aielah's disappearance received little in the way of media coverage. On February 7, the Prince George Citizen ran a story with Audrey asking the public to help in the family's search. The publication ran another story 3 days later, where police were interviewed and reported that, despite a confirmed sighting on February 3 and interviews with family and friends, there was nothing new in the way of information. About a week after she went missing, on February 10, a motorist traveling east to Prince George on Highway 16 contacted police after seeing something in the ditch near the Tabor Mountain Ski Resort. When officers arrived on location, approximately 23 kilometers east of the city's downtown, they discovered the nude body of a deceased female. Through the necklace found around her neck, Audrey was able to positively ID the body as Aielah. The public were notified of the identification on February 15, 2006. The highway on which Aielah's body was found is known as the Highway of Tears. It's a 725 kilometers stretch of desolate road between Prince George and Prince Rupert and has been the site of many murders and disappearances, starting in the late 1960s and continuing to this day. The majority of the cases involve Indigenous women and girls, and many remain unsolved. The autopsy confirmed that Aielah had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. According to reports, much of her body was missing due to animal activity, so the family were forced to have a closed casket funeral. Given they couldn't afford one, the vice president at D.P. Todd Secondary School launched a fundraiser to not only pay for the service, but provide the family with food. Aielah's body was eventually brought to Alberta, where she was buried in Gift Lake with a traditional native burial. The investigation into her death revealed that Aielah had gone to a friend's house late in the night on February 2 in order to ask said friend's mother for a ride home, as she hadn't wanted to call Audrey. When she was unable to obtain a ride, she was seen walking toward a house where drug users are said to frequent. Dozens of individuals known to spend time there were questioned, but were eventually cleared by investigators. A police officer who had run into her that night was also questioned and given a polygraph test, but was ruled out as having any involvement. Surveillance footage of the surrounding area was collected. It showed Aielah walking north on the 2100 block of Quince Street. At around 1 a.m., She was seen passing the Save on Foods gas station on 1600 15th Avenue. This helped investigators better develop their timeline of events, as the footage was considerably later than what they had gleaned from their chats with family and friends. According to Audrey, Aielah was last seen getting into a black van. However, it's not clear where she obtained this information. Less than 2 weeks after Aielah's body was found, the lead Lieutenant Band Council wrote a press release where they called on First Nations, the government, the police and the public to put an end to the violence young Indigenous women were facing. This led to the Highway of Tears Symposium, which was held in Prince George just weeks later. The result of the community and families of missing and murdered Indigenous women coming together led to a host of recommendations aimed at improving the overall safety of women throughout the area. Aielah's case is currently being investigated by Project Ipana, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police task force dedicated to investigating unsolved murders linked to Highway 16. It has examined hundreds of unsolved murders, sexual assaults and missing persons cases over the past 4 decades in order to determine if a serial killer is responsible for the cases. According to investigators with the task force, none of the leads or clues have led to any arrests or even a suspect in the case. After Aielah's death, her family fell apart. The children spread across Canada, while Audrey moved back to Edmonton, where she fell back into the throes of addiction, using drugs and drinking alcohol. She lived on the streets and refused the help offered to her. Audrey never gave up on finding out what happened to Aielah, despite the struggles brought about by grief. One day, she realized she needed to sober up, and in 2007 she eventually set out on a walk along Highway 16, from Prince George to the family's traditional home of Driftpool Cree Nation. Dubbed the Highway of Hope Walk, she was determined to create awareness about the murders and disappearances that have occurred along the highway, and through her journey she found herself wanting to further better herself and return to school. Her walk became an annual event, and while she often walked alone, there were usually support vehicles in her wake. Unfortunately, Audrey passed away on March 5, 2013, the victim of a vehicle collision on Highway 16, just west of Edmonton. At around 1:20 a.m. that morning, her vehicle veered into the path of a tractor-trailer and she died at the scene. According to reports, she had been drinking. After her death, the Highway of Hope Walk went silent but was revived in 2015, and she is now one of the individuals honored by those who participate. Those with information regarding the murder of Aielah Saric-Auger are asked to contact the Prince George detachment of the RCMP at 250-561-3300. Tips can also be submitted anonymously via British Columbia Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477.
Number 4.
On the evening on May 15, 1988, Kia and Renee were playing basketball with a friend at the court of a nearby park, located 300 yards from their apartment complex. At around 8:15 p.m., Kia decided she wanted to return home and thus grabbed her bike and left. Renee and their friend decided to stay at the court for a short while longer. Renee arrived home approximately 15 to 20 minutes later, and it was discovered that Kia had not returned. Bernetta spent a few minutes searching the area around the apartment complex, but when she couldn't find her daughter, she called the Greenwood County Sheriff's Office to report her as missing. The case surrounding Kia's disappearance was initially investigated as a simple missing persons report. Upon receiving Bernetta's call, a bulletin was released featuring the young girl's description, which informed the county's officers that she was an African American female who stood at 4'23", weighed 60 to 70 pounds, and was wearing yellow shorts, a yellow and white polka dot shirt, and slip-on shoes. An initial search of the area around the apartment complex by investigators led to the discovery of Kia's bicycle, which was located in the parking lot just outside of the apartment office. This would prove to be one of the only clues found during the course of the investigation. The responding deputy ended up spending the night on the Logan family's couch in case someone called with a ransom or if Kia herself somehow managed to communicate with them. However, no calls were received, and the real investigation into her disappearance began. On May 16, 1988, Approximately 75 people, including citizen volunteers, conducted another search of the area around the apartment complex, aided by helicopters provided by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, also known as SLED. This search continued until it was too dark, but resumed the next day. Despite their efforts, no evidence was found. After a few days, the director of Greenwood's Emergency Preparedness said the group would be suspending their involvement in the search and would wait for law enforcement to request further assistance before getting involved again. On May 18, 1988, police released a statement to the public which informed residents that two men were seen in the vicinity of the apartment complex on the afternoon Kia went missing. While they were not considered suspects, investigators did want to question them. The first man was described as being white, older in age, and with graying hair, and was seen driving a medium blue utility-type van with dark-tinted windows. The second man proved to be of greater interest to investigators. He was described as white, between the ages of 35 and 40, 5'83" to 5'93" tall and 250 pounds. He had a pockmarked face with pointed features, and his hair is believed to have been brownish with sun streaks. They were able to release a composite of him, which aired on the evening news, along with a description of his vehicle, which was believed to be a mid-1970s dark blue or black Chevrolet Monte Carlo. Witnesses said they hadn't seen Kia near the men or getting into either of their vehicles. Throughout the beginning of the search for her daughter, Bernetta begged the kidnapper to show some mercy toward Kia. In the weeks after, she would find it difficult to leave the telephone unattended in case she missed a call from someone related to the case. The Malakia Logan Reward Fund was established by Tuck Wooten, the head of AM Tuck Incorporated. It saw donations come in from both residents of Greenwood and local businesses, resulting in a total of over $20,000 raised. Numerous people called in potential sightings of Kia or of people who may know something about the case. These tips carried the investigation outside the Greenwood area, with investigators pursuing leads to as far away as California. They also tried to see if her disappearance was tied to other missing persons cases from surrounding states. On October 1, 1990, a deer hunter was walking along a pasture in a wooded area on U.S. Forest Service property in Newberry County, South Carolina. Along Mount Pleasant Road, also known as the SC-34 highway, he came across a badly decomposed human skull, which prompted him to contact the Newberry County Sheriff's Office. The location of the skull was 4 miles east of the city of Newberry and 35 miles east of Greenwood. The Sheriff's Office, along with other law enforcement and volunteer agencies, conducted a 3-week search of the area but were unable to locate any other remains. A forensic anthropologist with the University of South Carolina examined the skull and found it belonged to an African American child between the ages of 6 and 8. At this point, police were convinced it belonged to Kia, but were unable to positively conclude this, despite using dental records and the skull reconstruction techniques made available to them. In 1993, the skull was sent to the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. for DNA testing, but the results were inconclusive. 3 years later, in 1996, Newberry County investigators asked a private genetics lab in North Carolina to perform mitochondrial DNA testing using DNA obtained from Kia's parents, which suggested the skull did, in fact, belong to Kia, a fact that was confirmed upon the skull being sent to the FBI lab in Washington in 1998. Police have deduced that she was killed Greenwood County and her body dumped in Newberry County. Between July 1995 and August 1996, authorities in Georgia and South Carolina were investigating a string of abductions and sexual assaults of young black children along a specific state highway. All 6 victims had a similar look and profile, with all living close to the highway, and they were all sexually assaulted before being abandoned in a public area, bar one, who was not assaulted and later dropped off at a gas station, where she called for help. The only inconsistencies in the cases were the different times and days on which the abductions occurred, as well as the fact each victim cited a different vehicle being involved. They did, however, share a similar suspect description of a middle-aged white man with gray stubble, a pockmarked complexion and a tattoo of either a dragon or a snake on one of his biceps. It was not long until 52-year-old Charles Wade Hampton, a maintenance worker at the Hard Labor Creek State Park rest stop in Georgia, and a former employee of the Department of Transportation, came onto police radar. Not only did he have a snake tattoo on his upper arm, but he appeared eager to help investigators, giving blood and hair samples, as well as granting them permission to search his car and home. During these searches, they uncovered many out-of-place items, as well as images of nude women and adults, a pornographic magazine, torn-out magazine images of children, and several photographs of children in their underwear. Children's underwear was also found and sent away for forensic testing. Hampton openly confessed to committing several of the abductions and willingly provided details of the accompanying assaults, with most details matching up with what the victims had provided. He admitted to committing 3 child abductions in northern Georgia and confessed to having killed a child at an out-of-state farm. Police were later able to link him to a farm, which was owned by a friend. During the investigation, police drove him around to many of the abduction sites, and while he was able to share some information, he didn't know any of the minute details the actual perpetrator would, leading them to believe he was making up his confessions. Eventually, DNA testing would show that, while the same suspect was involved in all 6 abductions, Hampton was not the one who committed them. While in a Georgia prison, investigators in North Carolina and Florida were looking at Hampton's potential involvement in similar abductions and assaults in their states, as the abductions stopped as soon as he was locked up. This was in 1996, where he pleaded guilty to having drilled a hole into a women's restroom at a Georgia rest stop and was sentenced to 5 years. However, this was also when he stopped cooperating with authorities and recanted all of his prior confessions. Upon being let out of prison, he was immediately rearrested for the 1995 abduction and rape of a 7-year-old victim from Richland County, South Carolina. While he had previously confessed to the crime, he recanted, resulting in the rape charge being dropped due to a lack of evidence. In November 2002, Hampton was transferred to a jail in Greenwood County and charged with murder, abduction and intent to commit criminal sexual misconduct on a minor, all in relation to Kia's disappearance and murder. According to investigators, they'd had a case against him since 2000 and he'd, in fact, been a suspect since 1996. However, they'd waited to pursue their case, as they didn't want to risk activating an interstate agreement between Georgia and South Carolina, which would have required them to have brought Hampton to trial within 180 days of the charges being laid. According to investigators, they'd managed to uncover strong evidence linking Hampton to Kia's murder, including a version of events that included details only someone involved would know, which was enough for a Greenwood County grand jury to indict him on the charges. Given the case they'd put together, they were prepared to pursue the death penalty. Hampton pleaded not guilty to the charges and immediately recanted his confession, just as he'd done in previous cases. On June 22, 2007, the prosecutor announced that the charges against Hampton would be dropped, citing a lack of evidence to corroborate his prior confession. However, they did say they would pursue new charges should new evidence surface. Despite the charges being dropped in relation to Kia's murder, Hampton was convicted on obstruction of justice in relation to the Richland County case and his alleged false confessions. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with credit for time served and good behavior. As of publishing, there have not been any new updates in relation to Kia's disappearance and murder, nor about the investigation into it. The only theory in the case is that Charles Wade Hampton is the person who abducted and murdered Kia. This is due to his alleged confessions, which he would later recant. Police have shared that Kia's abduction was a crime of opportunity and that Hampton did not know the young girl. Kia's case was featured on a 1990 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. In 2009, the Malakia Logan Memorial Scholarship was established at Lander University in her hometown of Greenwood, South Carolina. Those with information regarding the case can contact the Greenwood County Sheriff's Office at 864-942-8600 or the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division at 803-737-9000.
Number 5.
The evening of March 15, 1989 saw Tracy working her first solo closing shift at Alien's Women's Sportswear, located within the Westridge Shopping Center in Frederick, Maryland. It was one of 2 part-time jobs the young girl held, in order to pay for university in the fall. At around 6 p.m., Diane stopped by the store to bring Tracy some dinner and found her alone, reading a book. The pair chatted for a bit, with Tracy telling her mother that she planned to head straight to bed upon getting home that night. 2 hours later, at around 8 p.m., Tracy's manager stopped by the store for a few minutes. It's been noted that the store's cash register did not record any sales after this time, and Tracy was again alone in the store from then onward. When closing time came around at 9 p.m., a security guard named Don Barnes Jr., who also worked as a sheriff's deputy for Frederick County, noticed the store's lights were still on. However, it didn't strike him as odd, as he assumed the cashier on duty was most likely still prepping it for close. He began to grow concerned when at 10:30 p.m. he circled around again and noticed the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. He called out but received no response and continued into the store to investigate, where he came upon Tracy's body in the back storeroom. She had been stabbed several times in the chest and back. The police were called not long after. When Tracy didn't return home at her expected time, Bill and Diane decided to drive to the shopping center. They worried their daughter may have experienced car trouble, but also recalled that she'd been late the previous night because she had been talking with her ex-boyfriend, whom she'd recently decided to start dating again. When the pair arrived at around 11:15 p.m., they noticed numerous police cars outside the store, which worried them. It was not long after that they learned of Tracy's death. Investigators at the scene found no motive for the murder. There was no sign of sexual assault or a struggle, and the store's cash receipts were still on the counter. As the door hadn't been forced open, and there was still money in the cash register, robbery was quickly ruled out, despite her purse being missing. Blood droplets were found in a rear hallway, leading to the store's loading dock and trash bins, and while no weapon was recovered, the wounds Tracy suffered indicated a knife had been used in the attack. As Tracy didn't appear to have any defensive wounds, it was the working theory that she was killed by someone she knew. However, investigators didn't rule out that the murder could have been committed by a drifter who'd been passing through Frederick. Numerous mistakes were made during the initial investigation. The first surrounds the doors to the back of the store, through which the murderer likely escaped. Investigators did not seize them and only examined them through the dim light of a flashlight. The second error involved the store's phone records, which were not subpoenaed before the phone company erased them. A man who had been waiting in the front parking lot for his partner spoke with police and shared that he'd seen nothing out of the ordinary that night. Given the evidence present, it's believed Tracy was killed between 8 p.m., when her manager stopped by the store, and 10:30 p.m., when Don Barnes Jr. discovered her body. Tracy was eventually laid to rest in Oak Grove Cemetery in Freedom, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. The case went cold until 3 months later, when a man called into a nationwide confessions hotline in Las Vegas, Nevada. The hotline was known for charging callers by the minute to record their confessions, which strangers could pay to listen to. The man, who called himself Don, left the following message, claiming to be Tracy's murderer. "Hello, my name is Don, and I'm calling from Frederick, Maryland. I know this is going to sound surprising, but 3 months ago I stabbed a girl to death, and you might think in making this tape I'm setting myself up to be caught, but there are a lot of guys named Don in Frederick. The girl I killed was working in a ladies' sportswear store. I often came by and talked to her when she was working alone, and one night when she was in the storeroom and we were talking, our conversation turned into an argument. And so I took out a knife I have with me at all times, and I killed her. And a few days later, I realized I had created a lot of sadness, and I thought about turning myself into the police, but whatever they do to me, that won't bring Tracy back. So I've decided that I better keep free because we have the death penalty in Maryland. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry about what I did, but nothing can change it. Bye." Upon receiving the call, an attorney for the hotline forwarded the tape to Las Vegas police, who, in turn, forwarded it to authorities in Frederick. Upon listening to the tape, they were convinced the man calling himself Don was the killer, as there was a sincerity in his voice, and he knew specific details about the murder. Investigators were able to trace the call to a payphone inside a supermarket in Walkersville, Maryland, approximately 8 miles from Frederick. On October 10, 1989, believing Don was trying to turn himself in, one of the investigators wrote an open letter to him, which was published to the front page of the Frederick News Post. It read, "I am personally willing to work with you to resolve this tragic situation, and I pray you now will come forward to relieve the hurt which Tracy's family and friends have suffered, as well as the pain which has consumed your life since that night." Approximately 2 weeks after the letter was published, a Massachusetts physician by the name of Martha Woodworth contacted the Frederick Police Department, claiming a man she had been in contact with was obsessed with the case and had asked her to help him solve it. He said his name was Sean, and he appeared to be fascinated with homicides, especially Tracy's. He had sent her numerous newspaper clippings about the case through the mail, which prompted her to contact the authorities. Hoping they were onto something, investigators played part of the confession tape for Martha. After listening to it, she confirmed that Don and Sean were the same person. A look at the envelope the newspaper clippings had arrived in showed Sean resided in Walkersville, where the phone call had been made back in June. On the first anniversary of Tracy's murder, investigators asked 4 local radio DJs to play the confession tape in full. The tape was played on the radio stations simultaneously, and within 2 hours someone had called in to say they recognized the voice. In total, 3 different individuals would call in and identify the voice as belonging to Sean. The positive ID of Sean being Don led investigators to pay him a visit, after which he pleaded the Fifth Amendment and refused to speak with them. It was also learned that his name was neither Sean nor Don. The next day, they returned to his residence with a search warrant, where they found newspaper clippings and material related to the case, items which were sent to the Maryland State Police Crime Lab for analysis. They also obtained a DNA sample. Despite the evidence they had pointing to the unnamed man, police were unable to find enough to file charges against him. They weren't able to confirm he was at the crime scene on the night of March 15, 1989, or had any involvement, and he's since been cleared as a suspect. To help bring in leads, local merchants put up a $5,000 reward for information. In 1998, a DNA sample from the case was submitted for testing. However, the amount was insufficient to develop a genetic profile of the killer, as was another sample submitted in 2003. In March 2009, investigators sent away Touch DNA for testing to a private contractor with the Maryland State Police, and it's been reported that they have samples from 2 individuals who are currently suspects in the case. The case has been presented to 2 cold case review panels over the years, one nationally and another from the Mid-Atlantic region, in the hopes of reinvigorating the investigation. It was also taken to the Vidic Society, which is a group of investigators who evaluate cold cases from across the world. The Frederick Police Department is still actively investigating the case, which is amongst the most well-known in the city. They still continue to receive information, and the Force's Criminal Investigations Division has a full filing cabinet and a couple of drawers devoted to all the files pertaining to the case. Recently, investigators have gone back and interviewed former detectives who previously worked the case in the hopes of uncovering new clues, and they remain in regular contact with the Kirkpatrick family. According to the police department, each new detective who takes over the case becomes personally affected by it. They consult with predecessors, discuss any new developments, annually review the case and consider any new ideas. Theory 1. The primary theory in the case is that the security guard, Don Barnes Jr., is responsible for Tracy's murder. According to his daughter, he was abusive toward her and her mother, and, as such, she believes he was involved in the killing. His father was a former sheriff with Frederick County, which has led some to suggest that a potential cover-up has occurred in order to protect Don Barnes Jr. Theory 2. The second theory is presented by a detective who worked on the case between 1992 and 1994. He alleges that an acquaintance of Tracy's was responsible for her death, saying that he'd visited the store that night to tell her he had feelings for her, but turned violent when she told him she wanted to remain friends. According to the detective, he had brought the case to a grand jury, from which 2/3 voted to indict, but that the state's attorney's office had declined to prosecute the case. While he claims that politics and personal agendas and people not doing their jobs are the reason the acquaintance was never arrested, those involved in the case say the indictment was not pursued because of circumstantial evidence. To avoid a suspect being protected by double jeopardy, it said they kept the case open in order to give future investigators the chance to obtain more evidence that would secure a conviction. Theory 3, a final theory presented by online sleuths, is that Tracy was a possible victim of the I-70 killer. The unknown serial killer is suspected of killing 6 store clerks in the Midwestern United States from 1992 to potentially 1994, with suspected victims in Indiana, Texas, Missouri and Kansas. Those who follow this theory speculate that the I-70 killer was active prior to 1992. However, there is no evidence to suggest this, and as police have never identified a suspect in the murders, it's not known if he was actually involved in Tracy's death. Tracy's case has been featured on Unsolved Mysteries and A Current Affair. The Kirkpatrick remains in the Frederick area. They continue to keep Tracy's memory alive, holding regular vigils at the Westridge Shopping Center. Each year, they commemorate her birthday by bringing either yellow roses or carnations to a cherry tree they planted in her honor at Brunswick High School. Tracy is said to have liked the cherry trees that blossom in Washington, D.C. In 2014, Deonda wrote a letter to her sister, where she described making a photo collage as a Christmas gift for their parents in December 2013. She wrote that making the collage made her realize that Tracy's legacy continues to live on in her nieces and nephews. Digital creative specialist Paul Puglisi is currently working on a documentary called In the Silent Land. Who Killed Tracy Kirkpatrick? The family gave him permission to tell Tracy's story, and the film is said to currently be in production. Puglisi has set up a GoFundMe page to help fund it. Those with information regarding the murder of Tracy Kirkpatrick are asked to contact the Frederick Police Department at 301-600-6219.
Number 6.
15-year-old Alice Lezan of Franklin Township, New Jersey was last seen on September 26, 1969. The grade 10 student at Franklin High School had decided to skip classes for the day and make the 2-hour bus trip to the Port Authority bus terminal located at 625 8th Avenue in Manhattan, New York. The building was a regular haunt for her and her older sister, as well as other teenagers at the time, and the young girl was known to enjoy spending time there. Alice was last seen that day walking near a hotel located on West 48th Street in New York City, New York. She was walking with an unknown older male, and she was wearing a pair of gray and white dungarees with a purple shirt. After this sighting, she was never seen or heard from again. Months later, on March 17, 1970, a young boy was walking in the woods near upstate Cortlandt, New York, when he came upon the body of an unidentified female. She was at the bottom of the cliff at Bear Mountain Road, a near 602 drop located near Camp Smith, a New York National Guard training site. She had been stuffed into a red sleeping bag, with her ankles, wrists and neck tied with rope. Concerned, the boy returned home to inform his parents, but they didn't believe his story and thus never called the authorities. On November 15, 1970, the young boy returned to the place where he'd found the body, this time with friends. The body had further decomposed since March and was now skeletonized. He again informed his parents of the discovery and, concerned, they contacted the New York State Police. Upon learning of the body, New York State troopers descended upon the area, which is located in northern Westchester County. Given the state of the remains, when brought in for examination, the coroner was unable to determine an exact cause of death. Despite this, he was able to say it was likely the result of a homicide. For 6 years, Alice's body remained unidentified, as her family had never reported her missing. In 1973, her brother was watching TV when a missing persons report began to air. He was struck by how much the description matched that of his sister, and in 1974 he officially reported her as missing to the authorities. However, it would take another 2 years before Alice was positively identified through the use of dental records. Now that they had a name, police are able to begin their investigation. A 28-year-old tree surgeon from Connecticut soon came on their radar. Described by investigators as a quasi-leader of hippie types, he was known to frequent the Port Authority bus terminal, and it's believed Alice had set out to meet with him on the day she went missing. It's believed he was a pimp who held other girls Alice's age on his roster and was trying to lure her into sex work, which she refused. He was known to communicate with other sex workers who, when questioned, claimed he'd told them Alice had simply gone home. They interviewed him numerous times, but the outcome of these interviews is currently unknown. Over the years, there have been few developments in the case. Police are looking for anyone who may have been traveling from New York City via the Palisades Parkway across Bear Mountain Bridge to think back and see if they recall seeing anything suspicious toward the end of September 1969. It's their belief Alice was killed and her body dumped between September 27 and 28 of that year. In 2018, the New York State Police renewed its calls for information relating to the case. Theory 1. Given how little information is available regarding Alice's murder, it's hard to speculate as to what may have happened to her. The current and only theory in the case is that her death was at the hands of the tree surgeon from Connecticut, whom police believe to have been a pimp. Some feel Alice may have been killed after refusing to work for him as a prostitute. Those with information regarding the case are asked to contact the New York State Police at 845-677-7300.
Number 7.
At the time of Caralyn's disappearance, she was 22 years old and living in a women's shelter. On August 2, 1997, Kathy and Kara made plans to meet the next day. Kathy's regular routine was to meet with her daughter once a week to buy her a meal, purchase for her a week's worth of groceries, and to sometimes get her clothes. When Kara didn't show up for their meeting, Kathy wasn't too worried, as she often lost track of time. 2 days later, on August 5, Kara missed a scheduled court appearance. The next day, a friend of hers called Kathy to ask if she'd seen her, as no one had heard from her in a couple of days. After this call, Kathy began to track down Kara's associates to see if anyone had seen her during the previous few days. On August 9, Kathy attempted to file a missing persons report with Edmonton police, but was denied and told to check local hospitals and jail cells. After 2 days, she tried again, only to be told she was still not able to file a report. The police service's refusal to get involved in Kara's disappearance led Kathy to begin searching on her own, and she began to pass out posters with her daughter's picture on them. On August 23, Kathy once again brought up her worries to police, but was told there was no concern unless evidence of foul play was discovered. Eventually, after 23 days of trying, she was finally able to file a missing persons report for her daughter, and an official search of the inner city began. Unfortunately, before said search occurred, Kathy was told by an officer that the next step would be to wait for Kara's body to be found, something which greatly upset the already worried mother. On September 1, 1997, a young farmer harvesting crops in his family's canola field in Sherwood Park discovered human remains. The field is on Strathmore Way in Strathcona County, near Highways 16 and 214. The farmer contacted his parents, who called the RCMP. When investigators arrived, they found remains that were decomposing, but not quite skeletal, and found it difficult to determine the body's gender. Kathy didn't learn about the body's discovery until the next day, September 2, as she'd missed the previous night's evening news. After learning about it, she contacted the RCMP to inform them that Kara had been missing a month, which led them to ask where they could obtain the missing girl's dental records. This would lead to the body being identified as that of Caralyn King. Upon the body being found, the investigation was turned over to the Strathcona County detachment of the RCMP. Kathy currently has a copy of Kara's autopsy report and says it's inconclusive. There are notes that the bones had scavenger's damage, indicating she'd been dead for a while before being found. Kathy has promised detectives she won't share the results with anyone, so as to not jeopardize the active investigation. After the first memorial service for Kara, investigators borrowed the guest book to review the list of names for any potential persons of interest in the case. It was later returned to Kathy. In 1999, Kathy wrote a letter to Edmonton's chief of police to voice her concerns about the investigation into Kara's murder. It was after this that her relationship with the police service improved, primarily because she kept on them regarding the status of the investigation. In October 2003, Project CARE, a police unit tasked with investigating Alberta's unsolved murder and missing persons cases involving vulnerable women, was created. It would become involved in the investigation of Kara's murder. Before Canada's national inquiry in the country's missing and murder Indigenous women began, Kathy had shared that she wasn't fully supportive of it, as she didn't think it would reveal any new information. However, she understood why other families would want one to occur. When the inquiry finally went underway, she shared the following recommendations: that there be public and respectful recognition of those who are missing and murdered, that there be a focus on consumers to help stem sexual exploitation, with more resources for those who are being victimized, that there be coordinated services for those struggling with developmental delays, addiction and mental health issues, and that there be more credibility for families and improved responsiveness from police when someone is reported missing. In 2012, Kara's remains were buried at Holy Cross Cemetery during a second memorial service. Kathy kept part of the cremated remains, which she placed in a small urn. Kathy says her relationship with the investigators of Project CARE is in good standing, despite not having received any new information regarding the investigation. She feels the overall investigation was botched from the beginning due to Kara's drug use and sex trade work. Theory 1. One theory held by many who have come across this case is that Kara's death is the result of a serial killer who is targeting sex trade workers in Edmonton. This is due to the numerous women who have gone missing on the city's streets and been found dead in the surrounding areas. Investigators will not say if Kara's death and the deaths of other sex trade workers is the result of one killer or many, but have shared there is no evidence to point to the murders being serial killings. Theory 2. Kathy wonders if convicted murderer Thomas Spekla was involved in Kara's murder. Spekla has a long criminal history, which includes sexual assault and murder. In June 2008, he was convicted in the death of sex trade worker Teresa Inns, and 2 months later he was found guilty of sexual assault and uttering threats in a case involving another woman. As well, in March 2009, he was convicted of sexual interference and sexual assault in relation to a 1995 case involving a 5-year-old. As a result of his crimes, he's been deemed a dangerous offender and will remain in prison indefinitely. Investigators have not shared if there's a possible link between Spekla and Kara's murder. Kathy keeps a shrine to her daughter atop a cabinet in her home office. It features numerous keepsakes, including candles, photos, and statues of angels, which surround the urn containing her ashes. Kathy has launched a website, which she's used to publish a manuscript of Kara's life story. It also features the records she's collected of 150 of Alberta's missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as resources for victims and information about anti-sexual exploitation. Kathy has become an advocate and volunteer for the Edmonton-based Centre to End All Sexual Exploitation, CEASE, and Victims of Homicide. In August 2018, she helped to organize a billboard to create awareness about the lack of resources available to those who are vulnerable and to generate tips regarding the area's unsolved cases. Instead of using a photo of Kara, she opted to choose an image from the Red Dress Project, along with CEASE's URL and logo. The billboard was initially set up at 97th Street and 111 Avenue and was later moved to Yellowhead Trail, an expressway that runs east of Edmonton, toward the area where Kara's body was found, and west toward British Columbia's Highway of Tears. Those with information regarding the case are asked to contact the Strathcona County Detachment of the RCMP at 780-467-7749.